All right. Awesome. We are here for Give Live, navigating privacy policies for nonprofits. And I'm so happy to be joined here by the Termageddon team, Donata and Hans. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah.
You sure did.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having us. We're pumped to be here. Everyone loves talking about privacy policies, right?
That's right. And if they don't, they should.
That's right. Yes.
That's right. We're going to make it exciting today, for sure.
For sure.
Awesome. Well, I would love to tee it off to you actually to start. If you want to just give us a little bit of an introduction, tell us who you are, and we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start. My name is Donata Strang-Skilrud, and I'm an attorney licensed in Illinois and a certified information privacy professional. I guess in that line, we will not be providing legal advice today. And I'm the president of Termageddon, which is a software as a service that has generated tens of thousands of website policies. And outside of work, I'm the chair of the American Bar Association's e-privacy committee, member of the ABA Science and Technology Council and the Cybersecurity Legal Task Force. And I'm also a fellow at the American Bar Foundation as well.
Amazing.
My name is Hans. I'm the other co-founder of Termageddon. I work with agencies and helping them help their clients with, policy solutions like Termageddon. And outside of work, I do a lot of work in the yard with our garden and work on my car when I can.
And before we started Termageddon, you were working at an agency. So
Yes.
You kind of know all the pitfalls and joys of agency ownership.
For sure. I ran a 12-person web agency in downtown Chicago. That's where I learned that, small business owners, nonprofits, they often find themselves being like, what do I do for a policy? And then they start to think, should I copy one from someone else's website? And I'm no stranger to that, until I met a privacy attorney and then married her. But our goal is to try to help people understand, the pitfalls and potential risks associated with downplaying privacy when it comes to their website.
Absolutely. It can become such a I never thought about that. And now it's becoming a problem and I don't even know where to start issue.
Yeah.
And I've certainly had some of our Give customers have that experience and then look for advice of where to go. So I love recommending y'all. It is, an awesome solution for actually getting, tangible results and having a good path forward instead of just kind of sending a bunch of information that people might have a hard time digesting, having an actual, somebody to go and ask a question of what do I actually need? So I'm excited to get into all of it and make sure that our customers feel really supported.
Awesome. That's great, Amber. Or Amanda, sorry.
I'm Camber today, so.
Yeah. I literally just combined Camber and Amanda, and it just came out as that. So
it's perfect. It's a compliment to be mistaken for Camber. Awesome. So with various privacy laws in place, how can nonprofits identify which laws apply to their organization, especially if they operate across different regions or countries?
So I guess to start off with, just kind of talking really quick about why it's important to figure out what laws apply to you. It seems like such a nebulous thing, right? Figure out what laws apply to you, but why? So privacy laws really dictate the requirements that you need to comply with. So they'll tell you what disclosures your privacy policy needs to have, what security measures you need to implement, what privacy rights you have to give to people, and who you have to give them to, and things like that. So that's why it's important to figure out what laws apply to you. In terms of figuring out how, there's a couple ways to do this. So first, you can hire a privacy attorney who can help you figure this out. Two, you can read the laws yourself and try to figure that out because they do have the scope of who they apply to in the text. At Termageddon, our first page of the privacy policy questionnaire helps you figure out what laws apply to you by asking you certain questions like whose personally identifiable information are you collecting, or who are you tracking online through tools like analytics or advertising, things like that. So a lot of nonprofits think, oh, I'm a nonprofit, that means these privacy laws don't apply to me. And it is true that some privacy laws will specifically exempt nonprofits. But there are other privacy laws that do not. So nonprofits usually don't have a commercial purpose. So if you don't have a commercial purpose, then you would need to comply with the California Invasion of Privacy Act.
Potentially comply.
Potentially comply. The United Kingdom Data Protection Act, GDPR, as well as Quebec Law 25.
There's our cat.
Sorry, that's Dora giving you a show here.
Hi, Dora.
And really, like, whether or not privacy laws will apply to you will depend on whose personal information are you collecting, who you're tracking online, where your donors are located. It's not necessarily about where your nonprofit is located. It's more about the people that interact with your nonprofit and where they are located. And if you're a nonprofit, usually you don't have a commercial purpose, but if you do, like, let's say you're selling or buying donor lists, then that opens you up to more privacy laws as well.
And maybe if I so may, I think you just set up and I was dealing with the cat. Privacy laws, they don't care about where your nonprofit is located. What they care about is protecting the data of their people. So like California creates laws to protect the data of Californians. So, you know, if your website's collecting names, emails, phone numbers, maybe behind the scenes, you collect IP addresses for analytics or security purposes. You got to understand where that traffic's coming from, because those privacy laws may apply to you even though you don't have a location there. And that's a critical aspect of understanding how to get a proper privacy policy. Find the laws that apply to you, because privacy laws protect people. They don't care where your business is located.
That's really interesting, especially for folks that maybe are new to fundraising. Maybe they don't know who their donor base is quite yet, and they're kind of like testing the waters and segmenting and trying to determine what's going to work for them, especially if they're navigating the online fundraising space fresh. They have a brand new website, brand new presence, whatever it might be. I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit. Is like, do they need to have a little bit of time to investigate that, or how can they investigate if they aren't sure where to start of who that audience is? Obviously, they can take a segment of who is contributing, but especially if they want to expand their reach, what kind of questions should they maybe be asking?
Yeah, so unless the website owner is like blocking countries from visitors from, or states or countries or territories, if they're blocking certain areas, most people aren't. So I'm going to assume to answer this question, no one's blocking anything. I personally prefer to overdo it rather than underdo it. That's a big reason why at Termageddon we just charge one annual fee. We don't charge on a per privacy law basis. We'd rather encourage our customers to embrace privacy than to like try to nickel and dime them for additional fees. So, you know, I relate it to our tool, but when our tool figures out what laws applies, whenever someone's stuck, I personally, again, not legal advice, but I like to overdo it because I'd rather just get the disclosures in there. And the vast majority of business owners I've met are not up to anything shady. They're just running a website and they're just trying to do right by their customers and their website visitors. So that's kind of my default.
Yeah, I think like a great example is CIPA, California Invasion of Privacy Act. So that applies to anyone that's tracking people from California, like through tools like Google Analytics, Hotjar, Facebook Pixel, session replay software, chatbots, anything like that. So for me, if I was an owner of a nonprofit and I had any of these tracking tools on my website and I don't block people from California, I would assume that, you know, there's probably going to be people that visit my website from California at some point, and they will be tracked by those tools. So I will need to comply with them. So that's a great example of kind of how I would personally approach this. But obviously, it's up to each organization to determine that. Like if I'm a nonprofit that distributes food in the Chicago area, and there's like no way anybody out of state would ever be interested in anything that I have to offer, you know, that's a different situation than, you know, I offer my services or I accept donations from all over the United States.
Yeah, that's a really good distinguisher. Thank you. I appreciate that. You mentioned commercial purposes as well. And I'm wondering if you might be able to define that a little more clearly of how it might translate to what that means for certain nonprofits. Like if they do have commercial purposes, like I'm thinking, and I might be totally off base here, of like somebody that actually has like a WooCommerce store where they sell things in order to receive money for their nonprofit. It's not necessarily a donation depending on how they're identifying that on a tax deductible receipt, but they are technically using those funds for benefiting their nonprofit. Is that kind of what you mean, or is it something different?
It's a little bit different than that. So commercial purpose means engaging in anything for profit, right? So one of the things that some nonprofits may do, I'm sure nobody on this call does this, but they have the donor list, right? So they have a list of all of their donors and they say, you know what, I'm going to sell this list to a data broker to make extra money. So that would be considered a commercial purpose. But having like an e-commerce store where you can buy like a t-shirt from a nonprofit and then that money goes into the nonprofit as like a donation, that would not be considered a commercial purpose. So commercial purposes mainly deal with buying or selling data. That's when nonprofits are kind of taken out of the nonprofit exemption, because that's not really something that nonprofits would generally engage in, if that makes sense.
What about selling like event tickets?
No, because, you know, if I have a nonprofit concert or something like that, that would not be so outside of the norm. But if I took the names of everybody that registered for my event and I sold that data to a data broker, yes, that would be a commercial purpose at that point.
Got it. That's super good to identify, because I know just throwing these words around, you know, sometimes when folks are new to this, especially like I am,
Yeah.
you know, it's good to clarify. And, you know, there's
Very-
lots of different ways to fundraise. So we want to
Mhm.
make sure that you're thinking about these things.
Very unlikely that something like that would happen, but it can happen. Usually it's things that, like, if you filed for a 501c3 nonprofit, it's stuff that would take you out of that nonprofit status anyway.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Mhm.
Awesome. So I got another question for you. So I want to know about what the most essential elements that every privacy policy should include, considering the diverse nature of data collection and usage among nonprofits. I'm assuming that it's important to think about like what are the critical elements to include for most nonprofits.
Yeah, so this would be, it really does always come down to what laws apply, because each privacy law lays out exactly what you need to disclose. And that's kind of a mindset we have here. It's like your privacy policy is either compliant or it's not. There's never this middle ground. So I think a lot of people seek for like, okay, well, they hear this and they think, what's the bare minimum I can do or something like that. And that would be a misstep, I would say. But just to answer the question and give a high level, I think there's two parts to a privacy policy. There is part one, which is a disclosure of the personal information you collect, what you do with that information. So like I collect emails, I use it to contact you. I also use it to send you newsletters or marketing emails. And there is the other, and so there's a whole disclosure of the personal information you collect and what you do with it, who you share it with. And then there's another set, which is like the disclosures required under the laws that apply to you as it relates to your nonprofit operations. So that can differ on a per privacy law basis. Like, do you sell the information you collect? How do you protect the personal information that you collect? These are types of questions that some laws require you to disclose it, others don't. So it does come back to the root of the thought, which is that you got to find out the laws that apply, because each law line items exactly what you need to say, but high level, those are the two buckets, I would say.
Yeah. And if I can just add real quick too, a lot of businesses and nonprofits will assume, hey, I have a GDPR compliant privacy policy.
Yeah.
So that means that this privacy policy is compliant with all other privacy laws, right? Unfortunately, that's not true. So GDPR has its own set of disclosures, and other privacy laws have other disclosures, and they do not overlap. So great example is Quebec Law 25 may ask you to list how you protect the personal information that you collect, and GDPR does not require that. So just having like a GDPR compliant privacy policy does not mean that you will comply with any other laws.
And if you're sitting there listening to this being like, oh, I didn't realize that, you are not alone. That is like how Fortune 500 companies think of it. Like they're like, oh, we have a GDPR privacy policy, we're good to go. And we're like, no, you're not. Like you may have dozens of additional disclosures that you're missing, and failure to provide particular disclosures is what gets businesses into trouble. So yeah, it comes back, find the laws that apply to you, because that will give you the roadmap on exactly what you need to provide.
I gotta imagine there's a lot of information out there that can confuse people, especially with like things that can be marketed to people like free templates or, even just the idea of copying and pasting policies for like doing something easy. I gotta imagine that that's a common thing that you might see, and there's a requirement for education in this space to be able to let people know that you really do need to take responsibility and ownership of that, like you said, to find the laws that are applicable to you and then start from there to make right decisions.
For sure. And for those templates that start off, we value your privacy very highly. And it's like, well, no, you don't. You found a free template. It's not compliant, even with the law it claimed to be compliant with, let alone everything else you've missed in your disclosure. So it's just one of those things. We got to just step it up. Our industry is getting regulated. Web is getting regulated. We either get to embrace it and have an opportunity to respect the privacy rights of our website visitors, or we can keep trying to keep our head in the sand and try to do what is considered the bare minimum, but what I would consider a non-compliant practice. So
yeah, there's so much like wrong information online. It's kind of crazy. Like as a privacy lawyer, I read this kind of stuff all the time just because that's part of my job. And it's like a broken game of telephone, right? Like nobody read the actual law. They just read other articles about it, and then they copy and paste from other articles where like all of them are actually wrong. So it's really hard to get like accurate information and know like exactly what you need to do.
Yeah, perfect. ChatGPT. So many people are like, oh, let's get a privacy policy with ChatGPT. That's perfect. I have full faith in AI will be able to explain exactly my own business practices. And, Termageddon, our tool consists of hundreds of questions, all conditional logic based. Unless the AI is asking you those hundreds of questions, I think it's quite a risky move to go with that type of approach. But
yeah, it's definitely not lying to me, right? It's lied to me several times. So I don't trust anything it says. Well, in this vein, I wonder if you could provide some insights into the potential consequences of non-compliance with privacy laws and how severe the penalties could impact an organization, especially in the nonprofit space.
Yeah, want me to take it?
Sure.
Cool. Privacy laws, the penalties exist in two kind of spheres. One is fines that are issued by governments for noncompliance, and the other are lawsuits issued by attorneys or citizens of a particular or residents of a particular state, territory, or country. In terms of fines, I believe the starting fine is $2,500 per violation. And what that means is per website visitor whose rights you've infringed upon. So if you get fined from Virginia under VCDPA, although that's for profit, that's a terrible example. Let's say Quebec, you get fined under Quebec Law 25. That would be $2,500 per website visitor from Quebec whose rights you infringed upon. So if you get 10 visitors, that's going to be a brutal fine for anyone, let alone a nonprofit. And then in terms of lawsuits, SIPA comes to mind, and that's $5,000 lawsuit per violation too. So that we're talking ridiculously high penalties, and what that demonstrates to me is that governments are taking privacy seriously. The penalties can be stiff.
Yeah, and we've seen, like in the news, you'll see Google, Facebook, whatever, getting fined billions of dollars, and that's what the news picks up. But I did want to note that there's lots of small businesses, even individuals, getting fined for this stuff too. It just doesn't make it into the news.
Yes.
But if you are curious and taking a look at that, you can go to enforcementtracker.com. That tracks GDPR fines. So that's a way where you can figure out like, hey, here's some small businesses or even single individuals that have been fined too.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that website only tracks the GDPR fines. There's over a dozen privacy laws elsewhere, but that website does a great job at least demonstrating that one law and the enforcements that are occurring from that one law. Enforcementtracker.com.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
And we're not affiliated with
no affiliate link.
No, just put that in the chat if anybody does want to check it out. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty high stakes here. It's a significant consequence, especially for the nonprofit space where they just want to, make sure that they're claiming every dollar. They don't want to be faced with a bunch of fines for something that they could have easily prevented.
Absolutely. And I think one other thing to note here is that consumers are increasingly looking for this stuff on websites too. So there's a great study done in Canada that said 7 in 10 Canadians will refuse to provide their personal information to a company over privacy concerns. So if you think about it, let's say you have donors coming from everywhere, you could potentially lose 7 in 10 donors from Canada if you don't have your privacy practices published and you don't feel comfortable using the website. So it's not just about like fines and lawsuits, which obviously is a big deal, but it's also about establishing and maintaining trust through potential donors and volunteers and others visiting your website too.
And I know this stuff sounds scary, and people are probably like, oh, why do I even have a website? There's just so many things I got to keep in mind. And like, I get it. Like, trust me, I get it. Like, but as someone who's been in privacy now for many years, turns out privacy is just like anything else in life. It takes a little learning. And then once you learn it, it's like, oh, this makes so much sense. Like, oh, I should get consent before I start tracking my website visitors and taking their data and sharing it with third parties. Like, oh, when I have a contact form, I should have a checkbox asking people to agree to our policies before they submit their data. And then it becomes our responsibility to manage it professionally. It's regulation. It's here, and we have an opportunity to embrace it.
And to your point, it does create that transparency and that opportunity to build trust with donors, especially in a competitive nature. Even in the giving space, of course, there's going to be a competitive nature of attracting donors, and maintaining their trust and transparency is a great way to build that relationship right from the very beginning. And especially where donors in different areas around the world are going to be more sensitive to how their data is being used. It's going to put some nonprofits above others in terms of the donor's mind of what feels more secure, what feels safer, what feels like your data is being cared for, because then that level of care transcends through the rest of somebody's efforts through a fundraising campaign, in my opinion.
Agreed.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you're submitting your information to a website and you get 1,000 emails and 10 texts a day, you're probably going to unsubscribe and not be interested in engaging with that organization anymore.
Totally. And even just that simple acknowledgement on a contact form, or wherever you might be seeing that, and adding to an email list or actually making a donation to a website, you want to have an awareness that the site owner, whoever is in charge, is thinking about these things, so that you do feel taken care of throughout the donor experience.
Agreed.
Absolutely.
So how are some ways that nonprofits can effectively implement consent mechanisms to ensure that individuals have control over their personal data, since it is important to so many donors?
Sure. So the first step would be to figure out where you're actually collecting this data, right? Do you have forms? Do you have donation portals? Do you have email newsletter subscription forms? Things like that, wherever you're collecting names, emails, phone numbers, addresses, payment information, any of that kind of stuff. And in that realm, you should make sure that whenever people can submit their data, that you have a little checkbox that says, I agree to the privacy policy, and the privacy policy is hyperlinked to that page. And do not pre-check the box, because that's not actually consent. And make sure that people have to check the box in order to proceed. If you do want to use information for like email marketing or text marketing, make sure to get separate consent for that. So you have a separate checkbox that says, I agree to, or I would like to have my information used for email marketing or for text messaging marketing, things like that. And then the other aspect is kind of the things that are happening behind the scenes of the website. So if you have analytics, cookies, tracking pixels,
video embeds, map embeds,
any of that kind of stuff that tracks people as they use your website, that's where you would want to have a cookie consent banner. And the purpose of the cookie consent banner is to stop all non-essential cookies from tracking the user until the user actually consents to being tracked. So there, it's important that you have both options presented, both accept and decline. You have to have both options. So don't have just, by using this website, we assume that you're okay with the use of cookies, because that's not actually consent, right? So people cannot be tracked until they actually click accept. And then they have to have the ability to withdraw their consent at any time. So let's say I visited your website and today I said, yeah, I'm fine with Facebook ads. But then tomorrow I come to your website and say, you know what, maybe I'm not okay with those anymore. I have to be able to opt out and change my settings too.
Yeah, I couldn't say any better. That's perfect.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I'm wondering about the text and the email. Like, are those requiring different acknowledgments, or can those be grouped into one checkbox of like, I consent to text and email? Is it like any communication that's just at least different than the other privacy policy acknowledgement?
So usually it's you would want a separate checkbox for whenever you use information for marketing.
Okay.
So when you think about it from a consumer standpoint, a lot of consumers are okay with getting email marketing, right? They're
Mhm.
totally fine with that. It's pretty common. You obviously want to get consent for that, but people are a lot more upset with text message marketing. It seems a lot more intrusive. So personally, even though it may not necessarily be required, I would have two separate checkboxes for that just to make sure that people are okay with you sending text messages, because that's something that people are usually not as okay with as they would be with email marketing.
Yeah,
Sure, and maybe they're reading fast and they just see
Mhm.
email and they check the box, and then all of a sudden they're getting text messages and
Yeah.
didn't actively acknowledge it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, putting our best foot forward and giving people the choice on and having everything unselected by default. I mean, let's think about this as people. Like when I fill out a form and I check the box, I want text messages. Well, congrats, you're going to be sending text messages to someone who actually wants to receive it. Like this is a win across the board. And I remember years ago, Donata said something that really hit me, which is like, I'd rather email 100 people that are interested in my product than 10,000 people that have no interest in my product. And
Mhm.
I think back in the day, we used to just like, all right, how do I email as many people as possible? And like you also have an inbox. You also get spam. Like, do you really truly open every spam email and take the time to read it? No. So I really feel like it aligns just a lot of current issues with the industry and puts things in place to make interested parties interested and to skirt out people who wouldn't necessarily be interested.
Yeah.
I'm sure kind of integrating some of these best practices, like spending the time educating your volunteers or your board of your nonprofit on these topics, it kind of does trickle down to the rest of the participants of the organization of respecting and acknowledging the privacy of the people that are contributing to your organization or who are volunteering for your organization. And those kind of like mentalities can be really beneficial, like you said, because you only want to engage with people that are genuinely interested in what you have to offer and to develop that relationship. And that's where nonprofits thrive, right? With recurring donations and the ability to retain donors. And I don't think you do that by lying to your donors or by doing sneaky things. And it doesn't even have to be so abrasive as lying, but it could just be ignoring,
Yes.
not being aware
Yes.
of the potential pitfalls of not paying attention to privacy laws.
Agreed. Yeah, you have a spiffy approach to your privacy practices. It's going to demonstrate to potential donors, like, okay, these people have crossed their T's and dotted their I's. Like, that's a good thing to have.
I'm sure you can get a little creative too with your cookie banners, because those are such like a front-facing thing. Like maybe throw in some fun language in there, like or just like I've seen that on websites, like where it's a little bit more quirky, a little bit more like, oh, I am accepting this, and it's a little more like visually appealing. Maybe some unicorn flies across the screen when you click yes. I don't know, like things that just make it a little bit more like engaging.
Yeah,
I think that, there are a lot of cool designs that you can have and like fun features, and you can make privacy fun, right? Because most of us think of it as a very boring thing. So if you can tailor it to your experience, I think that's great. One of the things to keep in mind is avoiding dark patterns. So
Yes.
dark patterns are design choices that either intentionally or unintentionally trick users into making a choice that's not best for their privacy. Great example, cookie consent banners will have a green accept button and then a red deny button, right? So for literally every person, you see that green button, you're like, oh, that's the right choice. I'm going to click that. And red's the wrong choice. But that's actually a dark pattern because you're tricking people into clicking accept instead of really thinking about their privacy choices. So yes, you can definitely make it fun. Just make sure it's not enabling any dark patterns or not confusing people, or making them make the right choice, make the wrong choice for them. You know what I mean?
Yep.
That makes a lot of sense, because you could, from a UX perspective, like really manipulate somebody's decision based on how the design is coming across. That's a really good point.
Yeah, that's a big one. A lot of companies have been dinged for that. So, but don't let that deter you from wanting to embrace this stuff. limit the amount of data you collect in the first place, and then have fun with, ensuring people can properly be educated, but also give proper consent whenever needed.
Totally, totally. Okay, so what are some affordable strategies that organizations can adopt to safeguard donor information to prevent data breaches?
So I think a lot of data breach prevention doesn't necessarily have to cost you anything. One example is training. So you can train your staff and you can train your volunteers in privacy and security practices. There are companies that offer training cheaply, or you can just create your own using, slides from Google or whatever, so that can be a great way to kind of inform people what to do, because most data breaches and most issues are caused by user error, right? So somebody accidentally CCs your entire customer list on an email, or they accidentally share a spreadsheet with somebody they weren't supposed to share it with. So having that training is really critical. To making sure that your passwords are of the appropriate length and the appropriate complexity. Again, doesn't cost anything, right? You can have a password change where every couple months, you guys go in and you change your passwords to something else. You can have two-factor authentication on your accounts. That's also a big one. Doesn't cost anything, but can make sure that that people can't access your accounts without the proper permissions. And I think also, talking to your volunteers and talking to your staff, right? What do I do if I receive an email that looks kind of suspicious? What do I do if a vendor asks me to change their account information for me to send their bills? Teach them about the most common types of attacks and what to do and who to talk to if you see one, or if you're not sure, maybe you saw one, but you want to confirm, and just have that open dialogue with them and say, hey, it's okay if you get a phishing email, you just have to tell me about it and don't click on anything, things like that. So I think a lot of that can be taken care of very cheaply or for free.
Another one to consider too, that actually may save you money instead of cost you money, is to make sure you're minifying where you place donor data. Stored in as few places as possible, hopefully one place. That's a huge benefit to a product like GiveWP, where everything gets sit in one place to manage donors. Like, that's a special thing, especially the fact that doesn't get shared with third parties. So that can also be a good practice, which is just not storing your donor databases in, a Word doc over here, an Excel doc over here, Google Sheets over here. Like, have it all in one place and be conscious of that. And that can help also drastically reduce the concern of breach.
Very good to know. Interesting. I just had a thought and it literally just flew out of my mind, but I did have another thought. A lot of folks are using a third party though to manage their donor data on top of Give, because oftentimes they'll need some additional marketing features. And a lot of folks are using things like Constant Contact or MailChimp and these other tools to manage their donor data, and especially to re-engage donors after maybe they have stopped contributing or they're trying to get other audiences to engage with their campaign. So can you speak to just when they do have data stored in multiple places, like what they would need to be doing?
There's absolutely nothing wrong with storing it in multiple places. And you just gave a perfect example where something like that's required to fulfill all the needs of a nonprofit, a nonprofit's operations. Termageddon's the same way. We certainly try to minimize with whom we share data with, but we have to use a processor. We have to have emails go out to our customers when they're impacted by changing legislation and stuff. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with sharing data with multiple sources. But, were you at MailChimp and then you went to Constant Contact and you never shut down your MailChimp account? Like, there could be trails that are left behind, for example, if you previously used other systems. So it's really just a matter of like, okay, I got to consciously think, like, when I'm uploading my donor data to a certain platform, like, I need to be conscious of that. That's someone's name. That's someone's email address. Like, I should be aware of, like, if I switch vendors, for example, that I'm shutting down the old system and requesting the data to be deleted, just to prevent breach issues that could occur.
Well, I would say first, you should know where your data is stored and what third parties you're using, because let's say somebody asks you to delete their data, you're going to have to go into each of those portals and delete their data from there. Two, you should disclose that within your privacy policy. So say that you're sharing information with email marketing vendors or email sending tools, things like that. And then lastly, you should aim to conduct vendor due diligence, which is reviewing vendors before you use them. Great example, there's a very, very well-known paper shredding company, which I will not name names, but it does include shred in the name. And I remember I was doing due diligence on different shredding vendors, and this vendor was subject to a lawsuit because they would take all the documents that they needed to be shred and they would transport them to a local public park and they would shove them into the trash can unshredded. So they've like totally and
It's their one job.
completely
Their one
failed.
job.
Yeah, totally and completely failed their one job, right? So if you're using these companies and you think, well, they said they're going to shred the documents, so I'm sure they do, make sure to look them up ahead of time because they might not actually do what they say they do. So just some basic due diligence, look them up online, see if they've been subject to data breaches or privacy violations or lawsuits, see what those look like, and then go from there because you want to make sure that your vendors are meeting their obligations too.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure, with nonprofits, having a team of people managing campaigns, possibly exploring other tools to grow their donor audience. Like I just keep thinking of, this volunteer training aspect or anybody that's part of your organization that like incorporating some privacy education early on in the training of like prepping a volunteer for their role, making sure that this conversation and acknowledgement of like, I understand this aspect of privacy. I understand how to understand donor data. And if I end up using a different tool than what we're using, like how to manage the data that I might import in there and then export it out of there and make sure I delete that account properly. Like those are all things that can be incorporated into like a volunteer training course, which one of our sister brands, LearnDash, does courses, and a lot of folks are using that for internal training purposes, and our nonprofit customers benefit from that as well. So I just throw that out there because it is kind of this thing that can be baked into your current processes of volunteer management and making sure that everyone that's on your team is like well educated.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Absolutely. It's not something that needs to take, 30, 40 hours or anything like that. You can just put together the basics, like before you use a new tool and import donor data in there, contact this person to make sure that this tool is okay to use.
That alone does so much. Because if you have one person designated who kind of has a little bit more of an attention to or focus on privacy, and the only rule is, hey, if you're using something to share data with something else, like talk to this person first. Like that one thing alone tends to resolve so many issues.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Totally. And, a lot of people learn from mistakes, right? So in the scenarios where nonprofits might be mitigating some damage and looking to like maintain trust with their donors after an incident, or even just navigating what the next steps are when data is breached, what are your recommendations there?
So I think the first step is to try to prevent incidents before they happen, right? Huge part of that, having an incident response plan, testing that plan, getting training done, reducing the amount of data that you keep or the amount of data that you collect can reduce the likelihood of data breaches. And then, responding to that incident. So how you respond to an incident is going to affect your reputation, right? A lot of companies are subject to data incidents. Sometimes it's their fault. Sometimes it just happens.
Yep.
It happens to so many companies. I think it's something that people are more okay with than they were before, right? Because we're seeing it so much more, but it all depends on how you handle it. So let's say I was subject to data breach in December and I didn't let you know until March, right? You're a donor. I let you know in March, hey, your credit card data was breached. Well, that donors can be like, well, what were you doing for the last 4 months? Why didn't you let me know? Like I was, subject to identity theft and fraud because you didn't let me know. Like I could have shut this card down. So making sure you inform donors appropriately of this kind of thing and how they're affected, as well as using other resources. So when you're subject to data breach, the two best pieces of advice that I can give you is one, call your insurance company. A lot of times insurance companies have a list of preferred vendors that they want you to use. And if you don't use those vendors, the insurance company will not cover the costs of the breach or the response. So definitely make sure to do that. The second one, this is going to sound really weird, but it is extremely useful, is know your local FBI agent. So the FBI has different resources for this, and they will not turn you down just because you're small, right? So they work with really large companies, but they also help small companies too. And establishing that relationship ahead of time is really important, because then you know exactly who to call, and then you can call them and they can help you. In terms of what happens after the breach, you have to figure out how to prevent this type of attack from happening in the future. So if your employee was, received an email from the bank saying, please reset your password, and they clicked on it and it took them to some other site, and that's how you got hacked, add that to your training, add that to your policies, add that to your procedures, and figure out how to prevent a similar thing from happening in the future.
Earlier, Dana was talking about doing vendor research, and there might be things that come up about data breaches. And I think one of the things when researching is, if a data breach occurs, how did they address it? Did they talk about it? They talk about improvements they made. That can sometimes win over a business or a donor instead of deter. So, and the examples you just laid out are great things that you could do.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it speaks again to that transparency of things do happen. It is the wild web, right? Like we do need to be honest about these things that occur and not pretend like it never happens or that it'll never happen to us. We just have to prepare and protect ourselves and do what's best when things happen. Because it's really a matter of when than if, but you can always make adjustments like you're saying and think of these things ahead of time. So I really appreciate your insights. I think that it's super valuable for our customer base across Stellar, really.
That's awesome.
Good.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, that's all I've got. So I don't see any additional questions in the chat at this time, but if anybody watching does have questions, I know that we would love to help you out and get you on the path forward towards managing your data privacy. I appreciate you both for being here with us today, and thank you so much.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Miranda.
thank you for having us.
Do you want us to chill, or are we closing up here?
I think we're all good.
Cool.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Have a good one. Bye-bye.